At the end of the day, the work has to be the win. Like most of your day is made up of the work you do. And so if that makes you miserable, there's really no amount of money that can solve that unless you're making so much that you don't have to work anymore.
There's a moment in every journey when curiosity quietly opens a door. For Billy Oppenheimer, that moment came after college, somewhere between travel, odd jobs, and the growing pull to turn questions into something more. I'm your host, Justin Ahrens, and this is Design Of, where we explore the intentional choices behind our lives and meaningful work. With a stack of books, a barely read blog, and what Billy calls a lot of reading energy, he followed a thread of fascination that led to one bold email. That email didn't start a story, but it changed his trajectory, launching a path of research, writing, and a creative partnership with best-selling author Ryan Holiday. Today, Billy is the voice behind 6 at 6, a beloved weekly newsletter connecting ideas from history, books, and everyday life. In this conversation, we talk about the winding nature of curiosity, why the work itself is the reward, and how even the most unlikely moments can lead somewhere meaningful. Let's follow that thread and see where it leads. Billy, thanks for being on the show today. Where do we find you? I mean, that looks like how I imagine it in my head, books all around you.
Yes, I'm in my little home office here in Austin, Texas. I sort of work in a sort of hybrid. I go into an office a couple of days a week and I work from home a couple of days a week. But yeah, I like to be surrounded by sort of the tools of the trade.
Well, I'm just going to get right into it because we're going to talk about your newsletter for sure. But I wanted to know, what's something you've been either curious about or obsessed with lately, inside or outside of writing?
For some reason, my mind went to baseball. I'm a big baseball fan. I'm pretty obsessed with the Phillies in particular, my teams. I don't really miss a game. Let's see, what else has been a fascination of mine? Just all things reading and research and writing is always a pretty consistent one for me.
My wife always makes fun of me. So I love nonfiction and I love history. So I'll read a history and then I'll read a business book of someone, or I'll read one of Ryan's books, and then I'll have to read some sort of brain Cheeto book that's really easy just to get me going. What about you? Do you have a routine?
I'm reading, it is mostly nonfiction, mostly biographies, history, memoirs, autobiographies. I sort of can't turn off the reading as a form of scavenging for material to use in my own writing or for the people I work with. And so I have trouble, like you, my girlfriend's a big fiction reader and she kind of teases me as well because I just cannot get through most fiction books. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, I'm reading and I cannot escape some part of me there's not going to be anything in here for the writing or the research I need to be doing. And so it feels like I need to be working but yeah, so it's mostly reading nonfiction for me as well. And then sometimes it's a case where I'm specifically diving into a person or an event in history or something to that effect. And that kind of channels the reading. But for the most part, it's kind of following curiosities, and I'm always ordering books and stopping and starting books and picking up things I've put down in the past and coming back to them. And so I just kind of like trying to find that feeling of getting hooked into a book. And so, yeah, there's a lot of trial and error in that way.
No, that's great. So talk about, you're a Phillies fan. So did you grow up in Philly?
Yes, I grew up in a suburb called Conshohocken, about 15 minutes outside of Philadelphia. Born and raised there. Went to college not too far from home. So yeah, I spent most of my sort of early childhood, high school, college years in the Northeast.
Now, was there anyone in your family that wrote or read or kind of influenced your path?
In hindsight, I can see some of the influence that my dad's a reader, and actually both my mom and my dad are big readers, and my dad is especially into like sort of old Western sorts of Louis L'Amour and all the great Western writers. But I didn't really find my obsession with reading and writing until after college. If I think back on my school years, it was mostly a matter of feeling I have to do good in school because I want to get into a good college, and I have to do good in school and college because I want to get a good job. That was kind of where I was for most of my school years. And then the reading and the writing and the research that I do now came later.
Let's get into that more now. So your story about cold emailing Ryan Holiday is legendary. So what gave you the confidence to reach out to him, and how did that moment change your trajectory?
I wouldn't have thought to do it if I hadn't learned that he had worked for an author when he was coming up. I should back up. I had started writing a blog that no longer exists, but it was my first kind of attempt at writing shortly after I graduated from college, and I was doing what I now can see as a very sort of cliche college kid is lost and travels to find himself kind of a thing. And I was doing a version of that. And it was in that time period that I started writing a blog. And a reader of that blog, my Uncle Bill, actually recommended Brian's book, Perennial Seller. And my uncle was sort of, hey, I think you have a knack for this writing thing. You should take it more seriously. And if you want to sort of learn how to do that, read this book I just read. It's fantastic. And so I read Perennial Seller. I think more than even the content itself, I was just struck by the amount of material that was being pulled into a single book. And it was the structure, the sort of way in which it was thoughtfully pieced together, the storytelling, the use of quotes from people from different domains, drawing connections from things that didn't really seem to be obviously connected, but in fact were. All these sorts of things like really resonated with me as I was reading that book. And so for the first time, at some point while reading it, I was just like, who did this? You know, like, and I think it was because I had just started the blog. And so I was writing, and I think for the first time it clicked that, oh, books are a version of what I'm doing over here on the blog to a much more substantial degree. And so it was the first time I had that moment of another person made this, and who is that person? And so I looked into, I just sort of Googled the name Ryan Holiday, just the author's name on the cover. At that point, that's really all I knew about it. And he had written, I don't know, 8 or 10 books up to that point.
Before we dive in, a quick note on who Ryan Holiday is. Ryan is a best-selling author, marketer, and one of the leading voices in modern Stoic philosophy. His books like The Obstacle is the Way, one of my favorites, Ego is the Enemy, and The Daily Stoic have shaped the way millions think about discipline, resilience, and purpose. He's also built a massive audience around this ancient wisdom and done it with clarity, consistency, and modern relevance. Here's how Ryan built his Stoic audience in his words.
I wrote this book called The Daily Stoic. I decided at the end of it, you read one page a day. I said, what do you do after you finish the one page a day? After you get to the 366th entry in the book, so you got to write an extra one for a leap year because you don't know what year people are going to be reading the book in. After you finish the 366th entry, what do you do next? And I started this email. And every day for the last 8 years, I've sent out the Daily Stoic email. I also do a parenting one called The Daily Dad. I've sent these emails out for free. So I've written basically 8 or 9 books totally for free now that people get piece by piece over email. But that platform is what has allowed the books to reach all these people all over the world. And it's spreading these ideas. They're, again, timeless ideas in sort of very timely formats or mediums. When I sent it out on my first book, it had about 10,000 people on it. The Daily Stoic email now goes out to 1 million people every single morning, probably the largest community of Stoics that have ever existed, maybe even cumulatively in the last 25 centuries.
Was reading his blog and just kind of went down the rabbit hole of his work. And at some point in that rabbit hole, I learned about his trajectory of working for writers like Robert Greene in sort of an apprentice assistant role. And it was around the time that I was wanting to try to attempt to make a sort of career out of writing and reading and all these things.
I think we just need to pause here for a second and talk about what's happening here. This is, I think, just so cool and fascinating. Let's talk about Robert Greene. He's a best-selling author behind the 48 Laws of Power, The Art of Seduction, Mastery, and other deeply researched books on strategy, human nature, and influence. His writing blends history and psychology and storytelling into frameworks that have shaped, thinkers, leaders, and creatives around the world. He also played a pivotal role in shaping the career of Ryan Holiday. Ryan began as Robert's research assistant, absorbing his process and his discipline and his approach to deep, intentional work. There's no doubt that experience directly influenced how Ryan built the Daily Stoic and his best-selling books on modern Stoicism. Now, Ryan is becoming Billy's mentor, making this creative lineage a powerful example of how ideas and process and philosophy pass from one voice to the next. Here's one of my favorite Robert Greene perspectives.
I have a chapter in Laws of Human Nature about the nature of your attitude creates your circumstances. There are two kinds of attitudes that I talk about. One is an attitude that's closing, that's constrictive, that's narrow. And there's one that's expansive and open. You could call that pessimistic and optimistic. But the closed attitude is you're only seeing life through this narrow little spectrum where everything is bad. People don't like you. There's hostility all around you. And what that means is you're not seeing reality. You're creating reality. You're creating that reality. You're seeing it, and that's what happens to you. The expansive attitude is life is amazing. All these incredible things are possible. I have hope. Any moment there could be an opportunity. And that's not reality either. But you're going to create that reality by feeling that way and seizing the smallest crumb of an opportunity. You're going to create those good circumstances. So by your attitude, you create the bad things that happen to you in life.
And so hearing that Ryan more or less just reached out to Robert Greene and offered his services, I was like, I would try to do that to him. And that first email was mostly a thank you for your work kind of a thing, because it really was, the books themselves were really helpful to me in that time period where I was, as I said, just kind of trying to figure things out. And so it was mostly an email of gratitude for the work he had done. And I tried to kind of subtly display the reading journey that his books had been sending me on it, and was just, hey, I've got a lot of reading energy. If there'd be a way for you to channel it into your future projects, I would love to help out, and I would do it for free. And he replied back and was glad to hear the books have been helpful. I actually could use some help. I'll be in touch. And then I didn't hear from him for 2 or 3 months. And at this time I was living in Colorado, and I was a sort of a ski bum. I opened this app Strava. You're a cycler, right? So you know Strava. Yeah. So at the time he was using it as sort of he had a bit of a following there. So it wasn't weird for me to see that he had posted a run not too far from where I was, and to know that was unusual, because I knew he was like, most of his runs were recorded not in Colorado. So I see that he had just posted a run in Vail, Colorado, about 15 minutes from where I was standing. And I pulled up that old email thread and was just like, hey, I just noticed I live 15 minutes from Vail. If you're in town long, it'd be great to meet you. And he was speaking at some conference, and he was like, if you come, try to find time before or after. And so I went, and after the talk, people were kind of swarming him to get a question. And he just kept sort of like giving me a head nod to follow him, and finally go up some stairs, and we go outside, and his rental car pulls up, and he's about to get in. We're just sort of having a brief conversation. I asked him a question. He recommended a book, and just very brief and casual. And then as he got in the car, he was, I've been thinking about hiring someone full time. Would you have any interest? And it didn't occur to me to ask, what would the job be? Nothing occurred to me but to be, yes, I would love to do that. And so I got home later that evening, and I had an email from one of his business partners. It was just like, hey, I heard you met Ryan, and take a look at this job offer and see if it's something you'd want to pursue. And that was in June of 2018, and I've been with him since.
That's so awesome. You had mentioned something that I want to ask about, because it seems like you've lived and worked kind of all over the world before settling into your writing career. And how did those experiences either shape your perspective as a writer and researcher, or was that just part of your traveling the world like Cain, looking for meaning?
It was really formative in a lot of ways. I played lacrosse in college, and so my first idea was I'm going to go to Australia and try to play and coach lacrosse there. And I'd heard that other college players had done that. Some guys that I like, friends of friends, had done that before, and so I knew that was a thing. And so I still am a massive fan of Heath Ledger, and I knew Heath was from Perth, and so I always like sort of romanticized going to Perth. And so I found some lacrosse clubs in Perth and reached out, and one of them got back to me, was like, yeah, we'd love to have you. You can coach our U15 team and play on the men's team. And so I moved there not knowing anyone, no real like job lined up or anything. And I got a job at a cafe making coffee, and then coached and played lacrosse. And I canceled my return flight and was just like, I think I'm going to stay here in Perth for the foreseeable future. And then a mutual friend from one of my high school buddies, his college roommate was doing the same thing that I was doing, but on the east coast of Australia. And he was just like, hey, I don't know how far you guys are from each other, but just wanted to let you guys know, like, you're both in Australia. And when you're that far from home and you don't really know anyone, like, any sort of mutual connection is worth exploring. So we were going back and forth, and for a while I was like, hey, why don't you come over to Perth and I'll show you around Perth, and then I'll come to Melbourne and you'll show me around Melbourne. And then he randomly was just like, hey, what if we got a van and lived in a van and traveled the whole coast of Australia? And I was, yeah, let's do it. And so I flew over, met this guy for the first time. We pick up the van the next morning. We lived in it for 2 months. And then after that, I went to Colorado for my first winter. I mentioned the skiing thing. And in Colorado, I learned that a lot of the ski instructors do it year round. So when it's summer here in the Northern Hemisphere, it's winter in New Zealand or wherever. And so those guys chase winter, they call it. And so I was like, oh, okay, I'll try that. And so I then did, from Colorado, I went to New Zealand, back to Colorado, back again. And everywhere I was just going with no plan, finding an odd job and figuring it out. And it was when the time came for Ryan to be like, hey, do you want this job that I know nothing about? It wasn't, I had the confidence to be like, worst comes to worst, I can go get a job at a ski resort and I'll be fine. And that would not be so bad. And so I think it really gave me that ability to just be not so focused on the sort of money compensation aspect of a job or an experience, and just knowing that I lived a really fun, great life as a barista in Australia. So if all else fails, I'll just go back. And so it was a nice sort of safety net in a way that I often think about was really helpful for me. And then aside from that, just the way in which your sort of perspective on, because I mentioned I spent next to no time outside of the Northeast for the first 24, 25 years of my life, and just getting out and just seeing the way different people live and what they care about and don't care about, and seeing that was all really helpful.
Do you know the name Dan Eldon?
No.
Dan Eldon. So his mom's name is Kathy Eldon. I met her and I interviewed her, but I don't want to spoil it for you. Look up Dan Eldon and the story of him.
I'm so grateful that this interview showed up during our conversation, because I get to share one of my favorite past episodes of Design Hub with you. Season 6, episode 34 with Kathy Eldon. Now, Kathy is an author, activist, and creative force whose life was forever changed by the tragic death of her son, Dan Eldon. Dan was an incredible young photojournalist killed while on assignment in Somalia at just 22 years old. But Dan's story didn't end there. In fact, through his beautiful journals, photography, and unshakable spirit, Dan left behind a legacy of creativity and courage and compassion. So huge that Kathy has spent decades sharing that legacy with the world, turning unimaginable loss into a movement for storytelling, connection, and purpose. If you've never heard their story, I can't recommend it enough.
I just love that you did that and you just kind of enjoyed the present moment. I think that's something that in my life too, and it's partly why I do this show, is to meet people like you and hear how you've designed your life, right? Or a project or something that you care about. And is there a particular lesson from either Ryan or another mentor that's really stuck with you the most?
One of the first things in that meeting, the first time I met Ryan at that Vail conference, when we were just standing outside waiting for his rental car to pull up, I had learned in my reading not only his books, but just about his sort of path, that he had left a job in Hollywood to become Robert Greene's research assistant. And it struck me because at the time I was sort of struggling with or contending with the fact that I was on a very different, unusual path from a lot of my friends. You know, when you go to a social event and it's like, what do you do? Struggling with the kind of judgment that I was feeling of not being as far along as somebody who can say I work at this investment bank, or I'm a lawyer, or any sort of like label that is immediately understood to be status or prestigious or any of those sorts of things. And so should I just go to law school? And just these conversations will be a lot easier if I can say something like that, rather than I work in ski towns and pour coffee and I'm trying to figure out what I want to do. And so it struck me that he did that because I was like, the decision to not only take what I imagine was a significant pay cut to leave Hollywood to be a research assistant, but also just to lose the ability to say I work in Hollywood. I sort of asked Ryan, how did you make that decision? And he told me that he looked at the people who were sort of 5 and 10 years ahead of him in Hollywood, not just like the amount of money they were making, the houses they lived in, and the cars they drive, but what their day-to-day was filled with, the tasks and obligations of their work. And then he compared that to Robert Greene's typical day. And Robert spends his day reading and making note cards and writing and engaging with ideas. And I thought I could imagine myself enjoying that much more than what the people ahead of me in Hollywood were doing. And he was, at the end of the day, the work has to be the win. Like, most of your day is made up of the work you do. And so if that makes you miserable, there's really no amount of money that can solve that, unless you're making so much that you don't have to work anymore. But the amount of money we were talking about here was not like it afforded you. That really stuck with me and was just like, it was sort of a relief to hear somebody who I so admire to say that and be like, okay, maybe I am on the right path here.
I love it. That is a brilliant perspective. So let's talk about 6 at 6.
Okay.
Can you walk me through your process for starting it, gathering it, curating it? Like, what is that?
Yeah, I would love to.
Yeah.
It started because, so I mentioned that first blog I had. And when I started working with Ryan, I was like so wanting to just do a great job that I kind of stopped doing my own personal blog and was just really focused on whatever it happened to be that was.
Let me jump in here really quick. Was that first personal blog, was that about like your travels and your experiences, or was it just kind of thoughts, or all of the above?
I think the reason my uncle recommended Ryan's work is he was kind of seeing a sort of kindred spirit in the writing, because I was using like stories from what I was reading to illustrate experiences I was having while traveling. And Ryan in his books doesn't really appear in them personally, but it's the research and the reading that connects to what he's experienced personally. And so that was kind of what I was doing in the blog. But so when I started with Ryan, I sort of put a pause on that for a while. And then in that period, I started doing his note card system, his sort of process for researching, which is just to read very widely. And as you're reading, you're dog-earing pages and you're making notes in the margins. And then after you read, you go through the book and just anything that stands out as, or holds up as being interesting or potentially useful, transferring that onto a note card and then filing those note cards into boxes. And so I started doing the note card system. And then 2 years into working with Ryan, we were having a year-end just meeting on how the year went and what's the next year look, kind of a thing. And he was, what do you want to do long-term? If you're still working for me in this capacity in 5 years, we both screwed up. I need to know where you're trying to get to, because then I can try to help you get there. And I want to be a writer. I want to do like a version of what you do. And at that time I was sort of battling the feeling that I needed to find my version of stoicism, in the way that he had his niche. And then there were other writers who I looked up to. James Clear had habits, and Morgan Housel wrote about money, and Austin Kleon wrote a lot about creativity. And so I have to find what that is for me. And so I was doing this really complex thing in a Google Doc. I called it Blog Doc. And I was just writing constantly in there and then trying to wait for patterns and themes to emerge as to what my niche would be. And I was explaining this to Ryan, and he was just, you're trying to map out the whole game, just throw the first pitch. And so after that meeting, I went home and I was, all right, I'm going to start a newsletter. I was thinking through, what do I do that lends itself to a consistent cadence of a newsletter, whether it's daily. I knew it wasn't going to be every day, but once a week or once a month, what do I do that would lend itself to being able to do that. And at the time, it was just, the answer was the note cards. I have all these note cards on hand. Why don't I just start sharing what I'm finding interesting and useful in my reading and note taking? And so my first idea was just to scan a note card or like a series of note cards each week. And I scanned like 6 or 7 of them, and I just didn't like the way they looked. So I was like, well, I can just transcribe them. And so the initial idea was just 6, and my number in college was 6. So there was no real thought beyond that.
But it's personal. So yeah.
Yeah. I was like, I need a number. And so it started as just, and the other thing that I knew I needed was the name has to be the day and the time that it goes out, because otherwise, left to my own devices, I would just keep pushing it to the next day and then the next day. And so I was like, the name is going to put me on sort of the hook for this is when it goes out. And so the Sunday, 6 at 6 on Sunday was the name. And it started with just 6 disparate. Each week I would go through my note cards and pick 6 random things that had nothing to do with each other. And I would send that out. And then over time, it was like, I'll pick a theme, and then the 6 cards will all be revolving around that theme. And that's kind of more or less how it exists today, is each week I pick a theme and I sort of set it up with the first paragraph, and then everything thereafter is stories that are connected in some way to that opening theme. But that was sort of the evolution of it.
So was there an early edition or story from one of the newsletters that just generated either the most readability or the most unexpected response from readers? Have you had some that have just really connected with people?
I'm trying to think. Ryan replied to the first one was, this is a good idea for a newsletter, which was just a huge wind in my sales. And for the first, I'd say definitely a year and a half to 2 years, it was like 200 people were on the list. I knew all of them. It was friends and family. And so it was slow building, but I was just like, it didn't even occur to me to wonder if that was like a problem or should it be going out to more people. And then another one of those year-end meetings with Ryan, he was, hey, how are people, the newsletter is great, but how are people finding out about it? I have no idea. And he was, you have to get on these sort of discovery platforms like Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn. And you see what we do here at Daily Stoic? We're on all those platforms, and we try to help people become aware that the newsletter exists and then bring them to the newsletter. And so then in late 2023, I guess, I started taking the newsletter each week and adapting it into a Twitter post that I would cross post on LinkedIn. And then through that, the newsletter has grown. But yeah, for the first while, I can't like specifically remember a time when there was one in particular that like really landed there's been positive feedback all along the way. That was one of them was like, that's the thing that keeps me up. It was just every now and again, somebody interesting or a reader would reply very thoughtfully. I could sort of tell that it was people were getting something out of it.
I have to share with you that I consume a lot of information, and mine's not all books. And often I'll sign up for a newsletter, and because I'll read an edition, I'm like, oh, this is really great. And then I just cancel it. And when I found yours, do another newsletter, then I read it. I was like, oh, this is really good. And I'm honestly, I'm not just saying this here on my show. You're one of the few newsletters I look forward to. So
thank you.
So bravo.
That will be a compliment that again is a wind in my sail. So I appreciate it.
Oh, you bet. Here's a question. And this is maybe more my design marketing mind. So as you think about going through your cards or picking your content, do you think about growing your newsletter? Do you think about the audience, or is it more still things that you find interesting personally?
It really is. What am I interested? What am I really, when I sit down to write the newsletter each week, typically I'll either go for a walk or I'll sit in the sauna or something and just let my mind wander and just notice what it keeps coming back to. I say, oh yeah, I have been thinking a lot about that recently. Let's go do a newsletter on that. That's pretty much the process for figuring out what the newsletter is going to be. But it's really just a function of constantly reading and collecting and making the note cards, because anything that appears in the newsletter is something that I've had on hand somewhere. And so it's just a process of seeing how those pieces fit together. That is like the writing process, but it's never like this famous person just subscribed, let me do one about them or
Got it.
you know, it's nothing like that. It's just kind of pure, what do I want to sit down and write about this week?
Yeah. I bet it would be tempting at times, depending on if something's growing, to think more about how to cater it for growth. And I think a lot of brands fall into that mentality. And at the same time, then doing that, you get rid of the authenticity that made you grow in the first place. And so again, hey, I'm a fan. I don't have a vote in it, but I vote for you doing it that way for sure. So as a researcher, because you used a phrase earlier that you had I can't remember what you said. You had a large capacity to read, or what did you say to Ryan originally? Something like that?
Oh, just like a lot of reading energy.
Really,
that you could
a lot of reading energy.
channel.
Yeah. So do you get overwhelmed or burned out sometimes, just trying to cram too many things into your brain? Or
There are definitely times where I go through sort of lulls where I can't seem to find anything that's really grabbing me. That's something that happens more than just being, I don't want to read. I always feel like I want to be reading something really good, and that the frustration is more, I can't seem to find anything right now that's doing it for me. Like, but yeah, I can't think of a time where I'm feeling burnout from the reading or making the note cards or those things.
That's great, because I know it for me, the reason I asked that question is, for me creatively, I get into a space where, Billy, it feels like 84,000 ideas, right?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to slow down and pause, and then also write them down as fast as I can so I can come back to them. And so I just didn't, in my mind, when I think about you making the note cards, I would think that I would see the cards in my brain a lot, and that would at times be awesome, and at other times be insanity, right? So you ever had to deal with that? So outside of reading and that sort of thing, what do you do to recharge?
I try to do something physical every day, whether it's a jog or a long walk, or I have a sauna in the backyard and I hit that thing almost every day. But I don't know, my days are more or less the same. Like, I read and write and get whatever work I need to get done, and then at some point in the late afternoon, I can start to feel I'm hitting a wall, and at that point I'll go for a run or go to the gym or something like that. And weekends are less, I'm spending less time in here or working, but yeah, that's kind of the daily routine for me.
That's great. So this may feel like a foolish question, but just came to me. You've worked with so many great authors, but the fact that you're so close to Ryan and Stoicism, how has Stoicism impacted you or changed your life, or what would be your perspective on that?
I always think about how I wish I would have found it or Ryan's work when I was in college, or even earlier when I was an athlete growing up and throughout high school and college. I really think it would have been very beneficial to me to have some of the kind of tool of Stoicism and Ryan's work. And as a college athlete, I can just remember being constantly worried that one mistake and coach was going to pull me out, and that would be it. And there's just things that would have been helpful. Just even the sort of core Stoic concept of focusing on what you can control. That was not an idea I knew about. But then I also wonder if you would have came to me at that time and been like, hey, read this book, it will be really helpful to you. I don't know if I could have been ready to receive it. So it's kind of it's an interesting dilemma, but I do think it would have been helpful, and I try to just appreciate that it now helps me on a daily basis. But I don't know, it's not like I sit down and think consciously of what from Stoicism is going to help me today. I just think it's like sort of osmosis. It just sort of seeps into you and just
part of your
steers.
DNA now?
Yeah, it just becomes how you are on a daily basis. And I think that is like the big one, is just being aware of the things I can be worried about and the things that are just, I would shoot. If I had a choice, I would not have wanted that to happen. That's just what it is. And then just getting back to what can I be focused on here.
I love it. All right. I have just a round robin of questions that have been showing up as we're here talking. So lacrosse, were you attack? What was your position?
I played attack throughout I started playing like 6th grade and then throughout high school. And then in college, I was moved to midfield. But offensive midfield, I was a little bit of a liability on defense. So I was like essentially an attackman because once the ball started going the other way, I was the guy that was designated to run off to get a defender on.
So
yeah,
you were fast.
I wouldn't even say I was that fast. It was just offensive. I was an offensive player. And I think if I was faster, they could have used me on defense.
That is awesome. So if you could have a conversation or dinner or something with an author or an artist that's no longer around, maybe even one you've researched, who would that be? Do you think Ryan would say Marcus Aurelius without hesitation?
Yeah, I think so. I think he definitely would.
When I read Meditations for the first time, I was 19. I was sitting in my college apartment, and I was just like, not only have I never read anything like this, I've never even heard of anything like this. Because you have the most powerful man in the world writing notes to himself that he never thinks are going to be published. Like pretty much every other book ever written was like a writer writing to an audience.
Yeah.
And Meditations was never intended to be published. He'd probably be mortified that we even have it. And so it was just a kind of philosophy and a way of thinking that I hadn't heard in any school, in any class from any adult in my life. And I was like, I want to tell people about this.
I'd be curious to know what exactly he would want to talk to Marcus about. There's a few things I think he would want to, but I do think without a doubt it would be Marcus.
Yeah, see, I don't want to play basketball or talk to Michael Jordan. I guess that's unfair because he's still alive.
Yeah.
It's hard for me not to want to talk to one of the ancient writers, right? One of the philosophers.
Yeah. I'm looking here. One of my favorite biographies is Becoming Dr. Seuss by Brian J. Jones. And one of the things I loved about that book and learning about Dr. Seuss, and the reason, I don't know this for sure, but I think the reason the book's called Becoming Dr. Seuss is prior to that book, when I thought of Dr. Seuss, you just think of his children's books and the guy that is just, I think still today is the greatest selling children's book author ever. You would just think was from an early age knew he wanted to be a children's book author or something. But in fact, it was just like a very winding path that he took to that career and that profession. And so I've loved learning about that, about him. And just, I think it's something and it may be my bias of I've in some similar ways have just kind of taken like this really bizarre path to what I now feel is the thing I love to do. I think a lot of people I look up to, it was kind of a series of flukes and accidents and setbacks that sort of forced them, and force maybe is the wrong word, but it was not a path that they sat down and said, I'm going to go after that. I was just I was just reading this book and they used the phrase following the call of interest. Can't remember where I heard that, but I loved it. And then eventually those things kind of come together in interesting ways. And so he's sort of top of mind for me right now. So maybe that would be the person I'd want to spend some time with.
Hey man, that's a great one. Well, hey, as we wrap up here, is your goal and dream is still going for writing your first book?
Yes. And that is in progress.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm working on it. Let's see, it's November of 2024. I signed a book deal with Penguin Random House, and so that book is in the works.
Great. I can't wait.
It's coming along slowly and steadily, as I've been saying.
I can't wait to share that. And I'm sure that there's certain restrictions, but is there anything that you can share about it from a theme or perspective, or do we just need to sit and wait, which is okay too?
Well, I told the story of that first time I met Ryan and what he said about at the end of the day, ultimately the work has to be the win. I later that day put that phrase on a note card. The work is the win. I have a section in I have now at this point I have like 8 or 10 of these boxes of note cards. I've got one right here.
Wow, that's incredibly beautifully organized.
Yeah, and so these are what I use. And at the front of all of them, there's a section called waiting room. And I found that I was, prior to starting the waiting room section, if I didn't know exactly like where a card fit within the other cards, I would not make it, And so I started the waiting room section to be, if this thing grabbed me for some reason, put it on a card and we'll figure out where it belongs later. And so I did that with that, the work is the win card. And then it was the first time where it not only became like a section, but then it became subsections and eventually its own box. And so as the newsletter and some of the social stuff was starting to grow, and I started to hear from publishers and editors and agents, hey, do you have a book idea? That was the idea I went out with. And so the title is The Work is the Win. And it's about trying to get to that place where you get most of your sense of satisfaction from the work you do rather than kind of the fruits of that work. But it has sort of, through the research and the reading and the writing, has become more about how do you get to that place. And so I'm trying to nail that, because the thing that kept coming up in the process of writing it, in the initial conception of the idea, I thought it was just that sort of singular idea of getting to a place where you get your satisfaction from the work. And then I was just sort of spending more time reflecting on my own path and research and all these sorts of things that I was doing. It's not entirely realistic at certain points in a career or a profession to have that. And so I kind of went back to the drawing board and felt like it's actually just an arc, and there's phases and stages, and so the book is kind of like trying to weave all of those threads together.
Oh man, I can't wait. I just have to ask a quick question. I should have asked this back when we were talking about the cards. I didn't even think about how they were organized. So does each box have a theme, and then within that theme subsections, and you put information in there?
Like what I was saying about the waiting room thing, at the time I thought I had to have sort of established themes, and then I'll be keeping an eye out for things that fit into those themes. And that sort of tripped me up, because if I found something that I didn't know where it fit. And so now it's just kind of like I'm constantly bringing in cards, and then as soon as 2 or 3 seem to have some sort of connection, they become a section. And the theme could be work, but more often than not, it's here, let me find one. So this section is it is called None of It is Wasteful. And it's filled with stories and ideas about, at times you think you're doing something and it's, what's the payoff here? And if it's not clear, it's, well, this may not be worthwhile. But in fact, I just have tons of stories of people who get to a point and they look back and all that stuff that I thought was irrelevant or mundane and menial is actually paid off in really interesting ways. And so that section is what that's about. But none of it is waste. If prior to collecting cards that connected to that idea, I wouldn't have thought I need a theme on none of it is wasteful. So that was just, none of it is wasteful comes from a quote that someone said. That section gets that name. And that's typically how it happens. It's like there's stories that are connected to some idea, and then on the front of the card is essentially maybe a header or a chapter title or something, rather than a one-worded theme or subject.
That's so great. Well, Billy, man, I'm really honored to get to meet you, and also get to say thank you for someone whose writing I've loved. And I'm sure you've even influenced me in other ways with the support you've given to other authors I love. So thank you for your work, man.
Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah, it was great talking to you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Design Of. I'm incredibly grateful to Billy Oppenheimer for sharing his story, his process, and his perspective. A reminder that following your curiosity isn't a distraction, it's a direction. If this conversation sparks something in you, take a moment to reflect on what's been quietly calling for your attention and consider where that thread might lead. You can find links to Billy's 6 at 6 newsletter and more in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone else who's navigating their own creative path. Before we go, a huge thank you to Sleeping at Last for providing the soundtrack to our show. Ryan's music brings so much depth and beauty to these conversations. I'm incredibly grateful. And if you want more, visit sleepingatlast.com or search Sleeping at Last wherever you listen to music. And of course, a special shout out to our brilliant audio engineer, Steve Wick, who loved this episode so much and made him wonder, what kind of music would Marcus Aurelius work out to today?
6, 7, 8, 9, 30. Finished. You did really well. You should be proud of yourself. I'm looking forward to training with you again at our next session.
If this episode sparked something for you, please take a moment to leave us a rating or review on iTunes or whatever platform you listen. Share it with a friend, post about it. It helps us keep these stories going. Follow us on X at Design Up Podcast and visit rule29.com to learn more about the show and the people behind it. Thanks for being here. And as always, keep noticing, stay curious, and design a life that matters.